Hi, and welcome back to Paladin Podcast. Today, I want to talk to you about a crisis. It seems like we have a lot of crises in the world today, but the crisis that I want to talk to you about is a crisis in the validity of research. And the crisis is called the replication crisis. What that means is that in research, normally somebody will come along and do some research, particularly psychological research, but it could apply to any kind of research. But psychology is what I'm dealing with. And so psychological research, they make a study and they make a claim, and then somebody else comes along and tries to replicate their study. In other words, if the first study was valid, then somebody else ought to be able to come along and do the exact same study and get the same results. The crisis is that in almost half the instances, they don't get the same results, which really calls into question the first study. Because if you can't replicate the study, then maybe it really wasn't legitimate in the first place. Now, before your eyes glaze over and you start to take a nap, I got this information from a new book. This is written in 2020, Science Fiction's How Fraud, Bias, Negligence, and Hype Undermine the Search for Truth by Stuart Ritchie, published in 2020. And he makes quite a serious claim. And it's interesting, since I read this book, I have noticed in other books that I've read and other articles that this replication crisis is mentioned. Of course, it's not mentioned on the news or anything like that, but apparently people deep into research are aware of this. And so Ritchie writes a book about what he feels contributes to the replication crisis and what we should do about it. So I want to give you a couple of his main theses and then kind of look at the content of the book and then maybe give you a few thoughts on how I believe about this as a Christian. One of his main theses starts out in probably the first chapter, and it says, there are a lot of serious problems with scientific studies, especially in psychology. Ouch. But it is still the best method we have of finding truth, even with all the problems. And this is hauntingly familiar to me, because when I was getting my doctorate way back, I remember taking a class in research methods, and I've taught classes in research methods since then. But way back when I was taking a class in research methods, I remember thinking, there are all kinds of problems with this. This isn't as ironclad as I was thought to believe. So I went to talk to my professor, and I said, there's a hole here, there's a hole here. This thing has a bunch of holes in it. This method has a bunch of holes in it. And he said, you know what? You're right. But it's still the only game we have in town. And I remember respecting him because he was honest, and then being a little bit discouraged to think that the main currency of exchange in my discipline of psychology is suspect. And so Ritchie comes along and he does two things in his book. And I think he does one very, very well, and he does one very, very poorly. And it's very typical of these types of books. The thing he does very, very well is to identify the problem. The thing he does very poorly, I think, is try to solve it. But fortunately, most of his book is about the problem, and he does a devastatingly accurate portrayal of what's going on with research. So let me give you another couple of his main assertions. The first one is that science is based on consensus. It is not the work of one person. Now, this shouldn't surprise us. Social scientists, particularly, that would be my field of psychology, don't just sit around and do research, and then all of a sudden the world recognizes, oh, you found some truth. It's not that way. You have to persuade. It's a consensus. You have to get your field to agree that you went by the rules, that you followed the rules. And so there's a group validation that goes on. It's not just, oh, I discovered truth, so now this is truth. And then he says, since science is based on consensus, and consensus is social, I think this is a really important point. Consensus is social. There's an element of persuasion involved that might not be all that objective. In other words, you've got to sell your work. You've got to convince this scientific community that you went by the rules and that you found something valuable to contribute to truth. And then the final solution, and this is on page 53, which I think is fantastic. He says, science, despite its built-in organized skepticism, what does that mean? Organized built-in skepticism is supposedly that you have to jump through a whole bunch of hoops in order to claim anything is scientifically true. You have to go through double-blind studies. That's like the gold standard in my field, and all kinds of other requirements in order to claim that your work is valid. And so science, despite its built-in organized skepticism, comes down to trust. And I thought that was fantastically insightful. It boils down to trust. At the end of the day, we have to trust our colleagues in what they're doing and what they're producing. And when I tell my students to do a literature review, which usually means going online and looking at the articles that are written about whatever topic they want to choose, they have to assume that the articles they're looking at were done correctly, were done without malice, were done without bias, those kinds of things, and that the consensus of the scientific community is that that article, that claim is true. Okay? So science is based on consensus, not the work of one person. Because it's based on consensus, and consensus is social, there's an element of persuasion involved that may not be all that takes away some of the objectivity. And therefore, science, despite its built-in organized skepticism, comes down to trust. And this gets me to the question of when you hear things like research says, I would think 98 times out of 100, and probably 100 times out of 100 if you're not a psychology student, but 98 times out of 100, you don't look up the receipts, so to speak. You don't look for the receipts the way that they're saying it today. You certainly don't look at the rest of the articles. In fact, when you do a literature review these days online, it basically gives you the abstract. And what that does is it's a brief summary of the study. And so rarely do you go into the guts of the study to try to see if what they did was even according to the rules, let alone true. And so most of the time when we hear research says, it kind of reminds me of growing up in church when I would hear the Bible says. When somebody says the Bible says, there's like a big bunch of authority behind all of that. And you don't argue with that because the Bible says so. Well, I think in my field of psychology, it's the same thing, only instead of the Bible says, it's research says. And when research says something, we're supposed to automatically believe it. But Ritchie says, because science is a social consensus activity, there's an element of subjectivity that plays into it, and there's layers of corruption that can happen. And this is why we've ended up with the replication crisis that he talked about earlier. So I'm not going to go into every detail, but I'm going to give you an example or just kind of an idea of what he means by these four things, and then give you what he thinks we ought to do about it. So the first one is that he says that the system, because it's a consensus, and you have to do some persuasion. And by the way, this is my field is guilty of this in the sense of academia too, because in academia you're supposed to publish or perish, and so there's a real pressure for you to come up with something. And so that's again, you have to sell your work because your career is on the line. Fortunately, that's not the case here at Cairn. There are other standards, which I heartily agree with. Anyway, back to what we're talking about. The four weaknesses. The first one is fraud. And the way Ritchie talks about this is that the number of retractions in scientific journals are increasing exponentially. There you go. What that means is that when you publish a study and then somebody finds an error in it, then you have to go back and publish a retraction and say, I didn't do this according to the rules, or it was just an outright lie, or something like that. And Ritchie's saying there are more and more and more of those. And yet he wonders, and I think he's right, if that's just the tip of the iceberg, because how many articles get fact checked? Now, there's a system of peer review that's supposed to be in place, but he gives a whole chapter on that and shows how, I'll get my Uncle Bill to look at your article if you get your Aunt Jane to look at mine, things like that. We don't have time to go into all of that. But the idea is so many people are getting caught publishing outright lies, and they have to go back and retract it. So The first one is just outright fraud. There's just a lot of fraud going on. The second is bias. And what does he mean by this? When you do a study, you have a hypothesis. And then you do your research, supposedly, innocently, trying to see if your hypothesis is true or not. And if you're a true scientist, you're not going to weigh the scale one way or the other. But by some magic of alchemy or something, 91% of the time, according to Ritchie, the positive results are published. In other words, 91% of the time, the author found what they were looking for. Rarely does someone submit an article to a journal that says, this is the wrong way to look at something. We have proved that this is not the correct answer. 91% of the time, we found what we were looking for. And isn't that amazing? So there's a lot of bias that plays into it. You know better than to send a journal you send a research study to a journal that didn't find anything. We found out one way that's wrong. A journal isn't going to really publish that. So that's fraud, bias, and then negligence. And what does this mean? Well, like bias, there are errors in studies all the time. And according to Ritchie, the overwhelming majority of these errors are in the author's favor. In other words, most of the errors that we find in research studies, the error moved the line towards what the author was trying to find. If these errors were just random, then about 50% of the time they would favor the author, and 50% of the time they'd be against the author. But instead, 90% of the errors are in favor of the author, which shows a sense of negligence. Either you're just not paying attention, or maybe it's part fraud or something like that. And so you're not following the rules. And then the fourth thing is hype. Because again, the scientific endeavor, especially in psychology, which is referred to as a soft science, you have to persuade the current field that what you found is actually worth publishing. There has to be a hype that goes with that. And so you can't just find something, which is what science is supposed to be about. Instead, you have to find something path-breaking or something epic. I've shared this illustration in class that there was in my town, I would drive by a church and they had a sign on the outside that said, Epic Youth Group meets at 9:30 or whatever. And I'm thinking, what in the world is an epic youth group? Why can't you just say youth group? But the word epic, everything has to be big and life-changing and field-changing and stuff like that. And so you've got to persuade a journal that what you found is not just truth, but what you found is an amazing truth or a field-changing truth or something like that. And so because of that, you have to sell your research. You have to tell the journal how great it is. And when you hype your research, you're not just presenting it as raw truth. You're presenting it as something you've had to sell to a journal. So we've got fraud, we've got bias, we've got negligence, and we've got hype, which is all part of the title of his book. And I think he does a great job of identifying how the social science research is riddled with this kind of thing. Well, he gets to the end, and how do you fix this? Because he's just like my professor in doctoral school. He still thinks this is the best game in town, regardless of how many holes there are in it. He still thinks it's the best game in town. So what does he think? Well, of course, his solutions are, one, we shouldn't be surprised, but then the other one is a little weird. The first one is he thinks there ought to be more government control of research, which if research is full of holes, you can imagine the bias that government is full of. We won't get into that. But to suffice it to say, I'm not sure having government be the ultimate referee is going to make anybody trust research anymore. But his other idea was pretty interesting, that because the method is supposed to be pure and it only gets messed up when humans get involved with it, maybe research should be done by robots. And this is an interesting thought. That's what I'm saying. But I just wonder if the proper methods of doing research or the generation of hypothesis, which comes from imaginative, creative brain, I wonder if robots can do that yet. I mean, already we have amazing tools to help us with statistical analysis. It wasn't long, 50, 60 years ago, where every social psychologist had to do all the math themselves, maybe even on a calculator, but still. Nowadays, you just press a button and it tells you everything. And again, that makes it even harder to check. But I'm not sure if robots should actually do research or not, because they couldn't really know how to analyze what they found. But again, because a human is doing the analysis, that again lays another layer of subjectivity. So what do I think about this as a Christian? I mean, I have to resist the urge. I really like this book, and I've always been suspicious of research findings. Not that I think that they're all fraud, but the suspicion I've always had is that research findings get elevated above everything else, like personal experience, like wisdom and rationality, like my own Christian presuppositionalism, and all of those kinds of things. Research trumps all of that, and then you find out that this main currency of exchange is also full of holes. So it's not like I want to do away with research, but I want to bring it back down to earth and not make it the supreme currency of exchange. Because as Christians, we have to ask ourselves, have you ever changed your behavior significantly on something really important as a result of reading a study that research says this? Now, I know there's a lot of people who do, like someone might read a research study on power poses. And so then when they go to get a job, they practice their power pose. Or something like, if you do something for 30 days, it'll be harder to quit on the 31st day than going forward. So I know people change their behavior because of research studies, but I don't think it really changes on something important. For example, in the New Testament, the Pharisees tested Jesus, it says over and over and over again. And the criteria for being the Messiah, Jesus met all that criteria to any open-minded person. But that's the problem. They weren't open-minded. Jesus would heal somebody right in front of these Pharisees, these gatekeepers, and they would criticize him for healing on the Sabbath day or something like that. Or worse yet, accuse him of being a disciple of Satan. And so the evidence was right there. And my field loves to talk about evidence-based treatments. And this is where I think that evidence-based treatment gets elevated beyond everything else. And the evidence-based treatment is subject to some of the criticisms that Richie is talking about. But I think as Christians, we have to trust the Bible more than we would trust research. And I think research by itself, I mean, if you strip away all these errors, can research really tell us about the deepest truths anyway? And oftentimes research requires you to have something called an operationalized definition. And that means you take something and you take a definition like love or patriotism or something like that, and you reduce it down to something you can actually measure with numbers. But what do you lose when you do that? A famous example that I give in class is from a game, a board game. That's my favorite hobby, is board games. This isn't my favorite game, but I have played it before. It's called Settlers of Catan. I don't know if you can see this or not, but this is a scoring card for Settlers of Catan, or it's how you build these things. And in Settlers of Catan, you have to build certain things like roads or settlements or cities. And in Settlers of Catan, if you want to build a city, you need 3 ore and 2 wheat. And if you have 3 ore and 2 wheat, you have a city. Now, I live in the suburbs of Philadelphia, which is a city. And I can tell you there's a whole lot more to Philadelphia than 2 wheat and 3 ore. But for the sake of this game, you have to reduce it down. That's what I mean by an operationalized definition. You have a definition that you can measure. Either you have a city, you have these resources, or you don't. And I think that's what research does. It reduces big words down to measurable bytes. But those measurable bytes require losing so much. Anyway, that's my little rant on research. Back to the book. I think it's a great book, of course, because of his critical nature, but I think he does such a good job of criticizing what's going on that I don't think then he can backtrack and then turn around and claim that research is this supreme path to truth, because he has just destroyed that path. I mean, he has accurately shown that it's really not that valid, at least the way it's practiced now by a bunch of humans. So I think as Christians, of course, we need to take a balanced view. I would say, if you can, I mean, if you've studied research and statistics and you know how to do that, you have the tools to actually look at some of this. But oftentimes we don't have those tools. And so we have to use other ways of knowing to give us sometimes suspicions and sometimes validity. Okay, so that's just my thoughts on what I think is a really good book. We'll see you next time.